Welcome to another edition of The Grapevine.
We've got a really exciting one for you this week, one I'm certainly really interested to talk about. Don't worry about what Mark Ritson can teach you about marketing. What can Kevin Bacon teach you about marketing? It's linked to the concept of 6 degrees of separation. Everyone is interconnected with each other. And a few years back, it formed a bit of a trend. How many steps away was Kevin Bacon linked to everyone else in Hollywood? And there's a website. It's still up, the Oracle of Bacon. But Ed, what is 6 degrees of separation?
It's a very big topic, Tom, that's actually kind of captured imagination, I think, for a long time, at least 100 years. And it's this fundamental idea that we are, as a society, kind of more connected than we might initially think.
Okay.
So through chains of connections between people, you can pass a message, for example, to a large number of people in the world that you don't know. It really took off as an idea kind of after the First World War. People were thinking about sort of building communities and economic communities within cities. And how do you connect, people who might be able to help each other develop businesses together? At the same time, you've got the development of the telegraph. The world is becoming more connected. It's easier to spread messages around.
Yeah.
The phrase 6 degrees of separation comes from the title of a play that was written in the early 90s. John Gare, I think it was, who wrote that play, attributes it to Marconi, the inventor of the telegraph.
Ah, right, okay.
His Nobel Prize speech from the beginning of the last century, when he brought in this idea of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
There are various kind of cultural references to it throughout the beginning of the last century. There's a short story called The Chain, which was written by a Hungarian author called Corinthi in the 20s. The characters play a game where they try and connect themselves to other people in the city they're in using 5 steps. And it's highly likely that Corinthi had heard what Marconi had said because they were almost contemporaries.
See, I always think this sounds really surprising because I'm 5 or 6 steps away from Barack Obama or Dave Grohl, these big people. And you think, well, if I could just go through a few of my connections, I probably could get them to come round and have dinner and, that type of thing. So it always seems really surprising from a kind of academic science point of view. Is it that surprising, or you guys look at it and go, it just makes sense?
So that's actually the kind of, I think, one of the most interesting things about this. So when the mathematicians got involved in the 50s, the kind of early studies in mathematics were sort of suggesting that this wasn't very surprising. And in fact, that concept in itself, that we are at all distant from people, is what's surprising. The reason that people came to this conclusion is sort of a natural consequence of, I guess, compounding or like just large numbers, right? It's similar to an idea that you have 2 ancestors, then your parents obviously have 2 each, so that's 4. So once you've gone back a few generations, suddenly you've got thousands and then hundreds of thousands of ancestors, right?
Yeah.
For example, if you go back to the Norman Conquest, then the number of ancestors you had at that period is much larger than the population of Europe.
Yeah.
Or definitely the population of England. So statistically, you're quite likely to be related to William the Conqueror. And the same sort of thing applies to your friendship networks and people you know.
Right, okay.
If they were all different people, so if I know 100 people and each of them knows another 100 people,
yeah, okay,
then in 5 steps you get to 10 billion, which is more than the population of the planet.
Okay.
Kind of, if everything was random, then actually this isn't very surprising. What makes it surprising is that we have social structure.
Okay, go on.
So the people that I know are very likely to know each other.
Yeah.
And that reduces the amount of new people at each step you get away. When mathematicians talk about this, we often talk about something called the small world effect. You meet someone, you find out you know someone in common, and someone says, oh, it's a small world.
Yes, yeah.
This idea of what was at the time called the small world problem really took off in the 50s in mathematics. And that was people trying to measure the amount by which social structure was getting us away from this random situation.
Okay.
And the most notable study at the time was done by a professor called Stanley Milgram. And basically what he did was he gave people letters and asked them to try and send it via people they knew. You have to be on first name terms with someone to know them. And he wanted people to pass these letters to a particular person. And at each stage then, there was also kind of a section in the letter where the person who got it had to sign off who they were and post it back to him. So he tracked the steps. And In some ways, his experiment was a colossal failure, right? The vast majority of letters just didn't get anywhere because, in some ways he was sending junk mail to people and most people were ignoring it.
Yeah, you sent me a letter and asked me to do something. I'm like, no.
Exactly. And then of all the letters that did get delivered, the average number of steps was 5.5.
Right, okay.
It's almost a historical accident that people were talking about 5 steps sort of theoretically at the beginning of the century. They did the experiment. It came out at 5.5. So 5 steps is 6 people.
Yeah, okay. So
if you think about that, there's 5 jumps between 6 people. So it all sort of boiled down to, okay, well, 6 is the number we'll go with here. And that's how we ended up with the 6 degrees of separation.
Very clever. Now, I know you said loads of great stuff there, but what I'm taking out of that, and I'm probably going to start telling people, is that I'm statistically related to William the Conqueror.
One of those interesting things, or something that really interests me about the 6 degrees of separation, is the idea that it is actually like kind of counter-surprising from a mathematical perspective, but from a human perspective, it's very surprising. And that's why that's why the idea kind of has floated around for so long.
You kind of say this has been floating around for, 100 years or, that sort of long. The world is very different. So we're a much more global society. So is 6 degrees of separation still valid, or is it more like 2.5 degrees of separation sitting here in 2022?
What motivated a lot of the thought at the beginning of this story was about the idea that the world is getting smaller and you're going to be able to communicate with anyone, and what is the impact of that going to be? In Milgram's experiment, geography was very much the first driver in how people got the message.
Okay.
Pretty much every message that arrived because whoever was the initial person to send the message thought, who do I know who lives nearest this target?
Yeah.
Once that had been received in the local area, it sort of bounced around the town until it landed on someone who knew the person.
Right, yeah, okay.
And transmission of messaging across geography quickly is obviously much easier nowadays. And I mean, one example we have of this is the number of steps on the Facebook graph. So the network that's within Facebook was sort of around 4. So it's come down a bit.
Yeah.
But not a huge amount. But obviously that is only people connected on Facebook. There are connections that are outside of Facebook that, potentially could bring that down even further.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it also sort of begs the question around, well, I don't know, actually, does it beg the question around the difference between online and offline? Like, are they different, or is that just actually a really silly question?
I think that's a really good question. And, it goes back to, in Milgram's experiment, what means that someone knows someone. So he defined it as you have to know someone on a first name basis.
Okay.
Now, that meant a bit more in the 50s or the 60s than it does now, where we don't really have this kind of formality of like the moment when you start calling someone by their first name.
Yeah, Mr. So-and-so, yeah.
It was true even then that there are ways of passing messages back then through people you don't know or very tangentially that now maybe have been solidified in online networks. That sort of solidification of those relationships has been much greater for what you might call your weaker relationships or your weak ties. Most people don't have more family and more sort of friends they talk to regularly on the telephone than people did 50 years ago.
Get you. Yeah, it's those people you went to school with or studied with or used to work with. We're now able to stay in contact with them a lot easier than we probably would have done in the past.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of suggests that, and this I think is quite an important point for marketeers, for some messages, the number of steps is smaller than others.
As a real world marketing, how do I start to apply this 6 degrees, this small world concept in a way that helps me, amplify the effectiveness of my budget, my brand awareness? How do we actually put this stuff into kind of action?
It's important to think about what message we're sort of sending and how we're looking at our network or a set of connections, right? Mm-hmm. So the Kevin Bacon game was where people were trying to find connections between people who had been in films. And this very much is the sort of the easy end of the message spreading, where you're saying, as long as I can find a link, then my message will go across it, right? Now, most marketing messages don't work like that. You've got to motivate people to share them. And crucially, and this is really important, what actually causes people to share them a lot of the time is the fact that they've seen or encountered that message multiple times.
Yeah, okay.
Now, this is where the property of social networks that we spoke about comes in.
Yeah.
So the idea that because a lot of my friends are friends with each other.
Just so I clarify something, when we say social networks, we're talking about real world
Networks of friends. Let's call them friendship networks.
friendship networks, yeah.
So when you think about friendship networks, messages can move around in small areas within them,
Yeah.
until someone sees it enough times that they start sharing it as well.
Yeah, okay.
That attitude towards our messages means that we're able to not necessarily just think in the sort of 6 degrees of separation. How wide, how broad can we spread this message? Because we don't want our message to just be spread. We want it to have impact as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's linked to a concept that I was reading about recently in terms of complexity as well and how easy things flow. If a stranger down the street walks past you and says it's going to be sunny tomorrow, you'll probably go down the pub, and if your mates say what's the weather tomorrow, you'll go, oh, it's sunny tomorrow, right? It's a low consequence piece of information to pass on, and whereas if some random stranger walked down the street and said, buy, insert new trainer company here, you'd think, who's that madman, right? But if you started to hear that if you went to the pub and started hearing it from a few friends, and then you went to, I don't know, tennis or basketball and you heard that brand 3 or 4 times within the networks that you move in, so for things that are a bit more high consequence than what's the weather tomorrow, circulating it in these small worlds, understanding where these exist, if I'm understanding you right, is how we concentrate on impact rather than just reach.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of that idea of messages reinforcing themselves via their spread through the network. So there's actually a related concept to the 6 degrees of separation, which is known as the 3 degrees of influence.
Okay.
And so this is a sort of social science idea from the early noughties. They were researching the ideas or what leads to people to have friends that have similar behaviors to them. Mm-hmm. And in particular, they were looking at health behaviors, so obesity, smoking.
Yeah, this was this was big news in the papers here in the UK, wasn't it? Sort of maybe 5-7 years ago or something.
Yeah, there were lots of "your friends are making you fat" headlines and things
exactly.
like this.
Yeah, exactly. Nice.
And what they found was that the influence of people's decisions, what people are influenced by, stretches to about 3 jumps.
Okay.
So if you want to analyze. Basically, if you want to predict whether someone's going to be a smoker, you want to know how many of their friends smoke, how many of their friends' friends smoke, and how many of their friends' friends' friends smoke.
Right, yeah.
One of the reasons why that is the case is that the influence is kind of being multiplied as it moves around this network. So as people smoke with each other.
It's really scary in a way now that I'm thinking about it in this context, because a really obvious example is, a health brand. You're going to get more success in the, that circle where 3 degrees of connection exists if people are gym goers. If you're selling protein shakes or whatever it might be, it's not necessarily where they live. It's not necessarily their demographic, their age or their education. It's who they hang out with. And that's the obvious example for lifestyle brands, but it's applicable everywhere.
Well,
right?
definitely. And you said there that it's not about geography, but actually we then self-assort ourselves.
Yeah, okay.
We tend to end up living near our friends. Also in areas where people are kind of similar to us.
Yeah.
So there's another study that came out around the same time that was looking at nudges, I would say, and influence through nudges. Looking at the spread of a kind of like health planning service. It was kind of like a recommendation system. And the number of people who took up the service increased with each recommendation up to the 5th recommendation.
As in an individual, like say when I received 5 recommendations, that was the...
Some people joined after 1 recommendation.
Yeah.
The 2nd recommendation had a bigger effect than that.
Yeah.
And the 3rd recommendation had a bigger effect than that. And the 4th and the 5th.
Yeah.
And then it started tailing off again because then people are less interested.
Interesting.
If you're thinking about it in a marketing sense, to get the maximum effect, you have to get that message to someone 5 times.
Yeah, okay.
From a referral. That is easier if you give it to one person, they give it to 5 of their friends, and those 5 of their friends all give it to each other.
Right, which...
than hoping that your chains across the country, your big message spreading, going really far and making the world small, cross each other.
Yeah, I think people often think about referrals as a passive tool or maybe a B2C tool. They put in a referral code in their e-com platform. But I think referrals are happening all over the place. If you can work out where they're happening multiple times or they're hearing it multiple times, this joke about 6 degrees of bacon actually allows you to use that interconnectedness to drive more impact from your marketing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that sort of understanding the places, or the sort of, as I would say, like places in the network where there is potential for that to happen, can really benefit you. So understanding, where are there a group of people who could start spreading messages to each other, and therefore, get that amplification of your brand. I mean, it's worth saying that even in Milgram's experiment, there is one sort of part of his experiment which definitely lives on today, and that's in the form of influencers. We haven't really spoken about influencers, but influencers are people with lots of connections that are quite important to the network. They tend to have lots of weak connections. So kind of the most successful of his experiments, half of the letters that got there actually went through one person.
Oh, right.
Who was the one step away, who was like I think he was a furniture maker, or he might have been like a tailor or something like that.
Who was very patient getting all these letters and filling them out.
And sent them all on as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But he's obviously like someone who a lot of people knew, right? So he was kind of like an influencer, I guess, within the community. The
rise of the influencer that we're all very familiar with in social media is because their connections are very obvious, right? It's very easy to see that, so-and-so has 200 million followers, or, whatever it may be. I guess what we're talking about here is how we can use that in the offline one, where it's less obvious, right? I don't know how many real connections you have, Ed, or how valuable they are, but actually what's important is in your social circle, you have that degree of influence and how that spreads. But it's a harder question to answer, I guess. Yeah,
I think it's much easier to target places and groups of people than it is to target individuals who actually have that impact, right? Because the big caveat, I guess, with the Milgram influencer example is he wasn't doing any influencing. He was just an important person in the network. He wasn't actually influencing anyone to make decisions. And that's always a sort of open question with influencers is, are they influencing through themselves, and to what extent are they getting eyes in front of some ads?
Yeah. And, I think like you just said about the 5 referrals needed for the healthcare, they might put the brand in front of someone. But if I see an influencer promote something, but I then don't see it again through my own social networks, it doesn't persist, and it never actually turns into any sort of monetary gain for the business.
There's an argument that influencers are most effective when they spark community discussion.
Right.
So, for example, there's a big market in gym influencers.
That's how Gymshark made their name, right?
Exactly. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we know that people who go to the gym hang around together.
Yeah.
So once you get that message in, people can then discuss it and sort of reinforce their ideas about that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And maybe general influencing is less impactful because it doesn't spark those conversations.
As good as Kevin Bacon is, and valuable he is, if you're really interested in making impact from your marketing and not just the clicks and likes, the so-called vanity metrics, understanding where these networks are at play and how you can influence them or use them to your advantage is actually a really smart thing to do if you can work it out. I think to sort of wrap up what we're talking about, how can people just experiment, I guess? There's
2 things that people can do. One is the kind of consideration aspect of it, right? Consider your audience as a network. Consider the relationships in your audience and think about how you might activate them.
Yeah.
And utilize them, and how you can design marketing which gets shared, but not necessarily in a viral way, but between people who are interested in the same thing. That's something you can do to try and utilize them without necessarily measuring them or mapping them or anything like that. The other thing you can do, there are tools out there for mapping networks and to try and understand the structure of the network that underlies your customers and your audience. You can use those tools to then inform your marketing and give you, advice or guidance as to how you might, target your marketing.
Good stuff. Thanks, Ed. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I certainly found it interesting, and I wanted to talk about Kevin Bacon and this concept for a while because it's really interesting because there's a lot to think about. So with that, hope you enjoyed it. As I always say, we're always talking about networks. So share this with people you think would benefit from it. like it, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time. Say goodbye, Ed.
Goodbye.